That's your choice. All right. So today we're going to be talking about how to add in things like politics or racism or neurodivergence or sexism without causing problems. And any other tricky topics you can come up with, I'm more than happy to try and answer questions on it. Those were just the ones I'm prepared to answer, though, so I may or may not be like curveball, have no idea what you're talking about, but I'll try. Um, so first thing I wanted to talk about is in general, when it comes to your own personal political views, I don't care what those are as long as you don't stab me, first of all. Um, second, um, I would say that in general, when you start publishing things, whether that's songs, poetry, writing, etc., in general, pretend like you don't have political views. Why? Because even if you have a great set of political views, your fans will still be mad no matter what you pick. Unfortunately. So your best option is to just not even mention it. Be like, guess what? I have political views. You're never going to know what they are. Just spouting off your political views has only ever caused problems for most authors and writers of all types. Um,
I would understand it's relevant, but
regardless of whether or not it's relevant, people just get offended. Like, for example, if I, which I'm not for the record, but if I was to say I'm a Democrat, then everyone in this room who was a Republican who read my books might be like, gasp, I'm never going to read your stuff again. I don't know why people do that, but they do. So, just in general, doesn't matter whether you're a good person or a bad person or you have good political views or bad political views. Just don't talk about it. Just be like, guess what? I exist. And when people go, so what do you think of the current political? You'll be like, you know what I think of the current political state in my own writing. Let's talk about that. You're like, can we talk about fantasy politics? Let's do that. You can talk about fantasy politics or dystopian politics or sci fi politics all darn day because no one cares about those politics. But once the second you mention you have an actual affiliation with a real political party of any sort, or even don't have an affiliation and just do or don't believe in something specific, you're going to offend a lot of people. And, like, sure, there are some people who say, hey, well, I didn't want them as fans anyway. Okay, if you really feel that way, that's okay. Just be warned that it's gonna potentially cause problems, especially because everyone always likes to believe they're in the right. For example, with Hunger Games. Hunger Games is very obviously a very political book, but she never mentions any specific political figures that actually exist today or any sort of political parties that exist today. She just vaguely alludes to the fact that maybe this is future America. Shrug. Hello. And so with that, but if she ever dared to say I am X political party, she would lose fans in droves because unfortunately everyone always wants to believe that the other side is the evil one, that the other side is going to cause the districts to revolt, etc. Just tricky topics in general and what to avoid. So but moving forward, though, when it comes to, speaking of which, when it comes to creating your own political parties in books, and any sort of political problems in books, because you can do that. It's actually highly encouraged. There's a lot of politics when it comes to all sorts of things, especially if you're doing something like a revolution in your book, then you definitely need politics. Um, um, Politics is basically, at its core, is just what you believe and whether or not you're going to force that belief on someone else. Um, so at its core, that's all it is. Um, but with that being said, just make sure that anything, even if it is supposed to be, futuristic America or futuristic Canada or China, I don't care. Just don't mention anything current regarding politics because then people are going to freak out. In general, just make up your own political party, especially because that happens all the time. New political parties are created on the daily basis. And so, as a result of that, you can just create some new political party, say that it somehow rose to power, and everyone will be like, legit, let's move on. And even if you are absolutely basing it on an actual political party, just don't say that. And as far as your fantasy world goes, I would say come up with things that they are actually concerned about. For example, with fantasy politics, magic structures. That might be a huge thing in your political structure. I can't tell if you're dying, you're raising your hand. Hold on, I'll fix the window for you while I talk. So, oh, calm down. So dusty. There we go. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Good thing I took a better draw. All right. So.
Oh, I can see the cloud.
Right, the cloud migrating this way of dust. It's bad. But anyway, so magic, for instance, or you can talk about different fantasy races. A great example of magical politics is Keeper of the Lost Cities, actually. They talk about the fact that they're like, hey, you can only marry certain people, and that marrying certain people thing, though they do have a good reason behind it. They just end up taking it too far. The good reason behind it being when you're elves and you live pretty much forever, you might accidentally marry a relative of yours. Because if you're living forever and they're living forever, you might accidentally marry, your like second cousin who was just born 100 years later. Because 100 years isn't that big of an age gap when you're lived to be 1,000. That's the equivalent of 10 years, which isn't that big of an age gap. So that's going to cause problems, and that's going to cause turmoil and issues politically. And then what powers people should or shouldn't use is going to cause issues politically. They talk about that in Keeper of the Lost Cities with pyromancy, where the fact that it's become completely illegal because they believe it's too powerful, and different things like that. So it's important to keep in mind when you're creating your fantasy political structures that oftentimes the things that are most important to them in their world are going to be how their politics are shaped. So you got to create a culture first and then create political structures, because political structures are born out of culture, not the reverse. Excuse me. All right. And then next thing is with characters and addressing issues that are real world issues, whether it's having fantasy racism to address racism, or having fantasy disease to address disability, or different things like that. Just make sure you do your research, especially if you're basing it on something else. If you're making up your own disease or disability, that's fine. But make sure that, like, if they're blind, you talk to some blind people, ask what it's like for them, different things like that. Maybe add in a twist by being like, magic is very visual, so they can't do magic or something like that, You can add some details. But the main thing that you're going to run into that could be a problem is when it comes to fantasy racism or sexism or things like that you make sure your character actually makes sense for that. We talked about this before, but this was a good example of how it's been done badly. There was a show called Girl Meets World. Overall, pretty fantastic show. Yeah, but that one of their final episodes before they got canceled, part of the reason why everyone was so upset about it was because they took a character that had never been sexist in his life and made him sexist. And it's like, that just doesn't make sense. If you're going to do something like sexism or racism, whether it's fantasy, real, or sci-fi, you got to make sure that it was a part of their character to begin with, that you're not just shoving it in there for the sake of political views. Yes, is it bad to be sexist? Absolutely. Could they have invented another rando to create sexism problems? Also, yes. They didn't have to make it one of the main characters that was already clearly non-sexist. Breaking character in order to drive forward your political views is a problem that a lot of people have. And it's not good writing. Better writing is having someone who's genuinely sexist say sexist things and then come to realize that it wasn't smart. That's fun. But forcing it upon a character that's already been established as not doing that is just bad writing. With that being said, other issues, make sure that you do your research as far as historical issues with racism and sexism, and even if it's not historical. Why? Because you can often feed from that. So even if you're saying, oh, my world has fantasy racism where they hate orcs or something like that, make sure that you look into what racism was actually like, because maybe they would experience similar things. Maybe that'll help fuel your ideas and maybe make it so that you can be like, these are some horrible things that actually happened that I can have happen in my book to just illustrate how bad that was and how it's not okay. It's not nothing wrong with having a political agenda. The issue is when you shove it down people's throat in a way that doesn't feel natural. You're just saying, believe my agenda, instead of being like, guess what? This world has problems. Let's talk about the world's problems. Kind of like Hunger Games. Hunger Games did not say, and this political party's the worst and they caused all the problems. No, she just said, what if this happened? Wouldn't it be a problem? And we all went, heck yeah, that sounds like a problem. I don't care who started it. That's a problem. And so she was able to talk about a lot of political things and a lot of political problems without actually ever saying anything specific or bad about anyone in specific. Um, all right, last thing that I'm going to address before you guys can just fire off as many questions as you wish um, is neurodivergence. And neurodivergence and racism and sexuality. In general, with these three topics, all tricky topics. And especially because a lot of people see them as political, even if they're not. And I mean, it's not political to just exist and have different beliefs when you exist, but apparently people think it is. So, with that being said, um, make sure that you don't create a stereotype, and make sure that you also, again, don't force it upon a character that doesn't make sense. There's nothing wrong with having gay characters if you want to write gay characters. What is wrong is having a character who acted straight the entire book suddenly have a boyfriend, and you're like, why are you gay? Like, if you hint at the fact that they're bisexual or hint at the fact that they've never really enjoyed it, like you see that they're dating girls and they're just like not interested and they find it gross, but they're doing it because their parents want them to. If you're foreshadowing it well, that's fine. But if it's literally just like I love girls, I have no problem with girls, psych, I'm gay, like that, no. Um, bad writing. Once again, the issue is just avoiding bad writing, really. You shouldn't force anything on your characters that feels weird. Even if it's just like, guess what? This whole time I thought that I wasn't. That I was an orphan, psych, my parents are alive. And it's like you literally saw them die in front of you. Like, just don't do the 180 twist that just ends up being bad. Um, and then the last thing is with neurodivergence and sexuality and things like that, make sure that they don't become a stereotype. There are all sorts of stereotypes out there. And yes, some stereotypes are true. For example, I have a friend who went to the South on his LDS mission, and he said that they went to a Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant. There's the stereotype that black people love fried chicken, and everyone's like, oh, it's a stereotype, that's hurtful. It's not actually that hurtful if it's true. They went to a fried chicken restaurant, and they were the only white people there. So, like, that doesn't make it rude at that point. Now, if that's the only thing they ever eat, then yeah, that's a little racist. That's actually a lot racist. But if it's just every once in a while they enjoy some fried chicken, that's not racist. That's just something they enjoy. Nothing wrong with that. I enjoy fried chicken too. That doesn't make me suddenly a racist. Um, so, but make sure that doesn't become their only personality and that they don't become a stereotype. You want to make sure that their race and their sexuality and other traits are a part of them and don't become all these harmful stereotypes. And also, much with neurodivergence, make sure that you talk to people who are actually from that neurodivergence about what their experience is. And yes, everyone's experience is different. For example, if you talk to two people with OCD, they might have entirely different experiences, but they will have some overlap. And so it's important to discuss that overlap and to make sure that you're not doing it in an offensive way. Make sure that you're doing it in a way that is actually realistic and not just something that is a myth that people have peddled or something that people have made up or that something that people have misinterpreted. You want to make sure you're getting it straight from the source rather than drinking some random bottle of Kool-Aid and saying it's accurate. All right. Now, any questions regarding tricky topics and how to address them? Yes.
This isn't really much about
Comment
comment.
works too.
To the neurodivergence
Yeah.
and also the Robin's World.
Mhm.
They also did an episode about neurodivergence,
Mhm.
specifically autism.
Yeah.
And it could have went well. However, how they portrayed it essentially they had this like super genius character, kind of the stereotype of
Mhm.
all autistics are geniuses, and they also acted like it was a disease.
Yeah.
And throughout the show, they just is it like after that when they just made it very awkward, and I'm just like,
Yeah, unfortunately a lot of people don't handle things well, and even if they wanted to like act like it was a disease at first and then realize it's not and then be like, oh, I'm sorry, that was a problem, but they didn't do that. And so it's important to acknowledge if there are bad stereotypes, it's important to acknowledge them. It's kind of like at one point I read a historical fiction novel about when I was your guys' age about the AIDS epidemic and the fact that some people could get AIDS from a blood transfusion because we didn't realize it was passed through blood at the time. And so there were kids that literally had AIDS that people were saying were horrible, sinful, terrible kids. And it's like, I literally just got a blood transfusion because my leg got broken or different things like that. And it's tragic and it's horrible that that happened. But it's important that we address those things, and instead of just saying, oh, they are a horrible, terrible kid, they're saying, okay, well, but it's passed through blood and this could have happened to literally anyone. And isn't it tragic that we're treating this kid who's literally 8 years old like they're a terrible person because of a mistake a doctor made? That's not okay. But they addressed it. They made sure to talk about it. They made sure to say, okay, yes, this is bad and harmful. So if you're going to have bad and harmful things in your novel, make sure that you address that they're bad and harmful. You don't just leave them there. And like I said with the stereotypes, I think that was part of the issue too. They had a lot of stereotypes. And it's important to avoid those stereotypes. Nothing wrong with having your autistic character be a genius. There are a lot of autistic geniuses. But you also need to act like not everyone who is a part of this or everyone who has this has X thing. Um,
Yeah, most neurodivergence is
mhm.
a spectrum.
Exactly, it's a spectrum, and on top of that, it's important to remember that, like I said, everyone manifests things differently when it comes to mental health. I've literally talked to people who both have anxiety or both have depression or both have OCD, and they both have drastically different experiences. Some overlap, but they have their own unique manifestation of it. So it's important not to just make it blank slate, this is how it looks. Especially when it comes to male versus female, because males and females actually present very differently when it comes to mental health struggles. And especially when it comes to things like ADHD or autism or different things like that. So it's important you do your research and that you don't just make them all seem the same. Any other questions or comments regarding struggles with writing hard things in fantasy, like in general? Seems like you have a thought, or a thought is potentially the thought is running away. Okay, that's okay. If you want, you can just re-bring up a topic and then clarify it.
I can't even think of what it is.
You're like, it's
I'm
there.
asking about.
It's there. What topic was it on?
I don't know.
I can re-bring up
Like,
the topic
I
if
know
that's
there
helpful.
was something that
Hmm.
I classifies as this, but
Yeah. Was
No.
it something that we've
No
discussed
way.
already, or was it an off-brand topic?
I don't think we've discussed it. I don't know.
Okay, that's okay. If you
I
come back to
remember
it, remember. But yeah, as far as fantasy and science fiction goes, it's tough. It's tricky. It's not easy to tackle some of these topics. It's not easy to tackle a lot of topics. Oh, one other thing that I forgot to mention that I probably should mention: trauma. Make sure to mention if you have any sort of traumatizing events in your novel in your little forward section. You don't have to spoil things, but you can certainly at least mention it. And I know some people are like, oh, well, it's obvious when blah, 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 blah. It's not obvious typically. Trust me. As someone who's read the spoilers and then read the book, sometimes I don't realize that I've hit the part until I'm like, oh, that's what they're referring to. Like, I don't see it coming. So don't be worried about that when putting trigger warnings at the beginning of your book. And it's important to put those in there because sometimes people want to enjoy a certain book, but then they're like, oh, this is an incredibly sensitive topic for me. Like for me, when my mom died from cancer, I pretty much can't read any books about cancer now because it's just too sensitive for me. It hurts to read. And so as a result of that, any ones that have trigger warnings and say death by cancer, I immediately am like, not going to be able to read that. But it's important because then you don't have someone enjoying a book and then all of a sudden get halfway through and they're dealing with this trauma all over again. It's not fun. And I know that it can seem like, oh, well, they're just being too sensitive. Well, but there's things you're sensitive about too, so it's good to be respectful of those. Yes.
When would you know when to put a trigger?
In general, if it could cause trauma, you should probably mention it. So, for example, self harm, suicidality, dying of any sort of death by some sort of disease, because someone could have been affected by that. Any sort of other horrible things that I don't want to mention here, war crimes, torture, etc. You generally want to mention that. Again, you don't have to be like, here's explicit detail of how it works. You can literally just say, like, hey, there's a character in here who contemplates self harm or different things like that. And then the person knows, okay, I struggle with self harm. Maybe I shouldn't read this. I don't struggle with self harm. but just as an example, that's something that someone who, especially with mental health, if someone is prone to those kinds of behaviors and then reads about them, it can sometimes cause them to relapse, and that's not good. That's bad.
So, like, would you like a trigger warning?
At the very first bit, so basically they open the title page and then it says thank you to whomever you wish to thank, and then the next page says trigger warning in
I
all
got that
caps.
part, but I'm talking about like
Yeah.
the specifics. Like, would you put in a trigger warning for like a character that suffers with depression or anxiety or PTSD?
Yeah. I would definitely add that. Just because some people reading about someone having a super depressed episode can cause them to trigger a spiral. And there's nothing wrong with writing about those things. I have actually read several books about those kind of mental health things, and I felt it was very beautifully done, and it brought great awareness to the mental health community, especially for those who don't struggle with it, to better understand what they're going through. 100% a good thing. But if, again, someone who's struggling with those things reads about you describing what a depression spiral is like, and they have depression, that could potentially trigger a spiral. And we don't want to do that. If you want to, you can even do what some authors do and say trigger warnings on specific chapters. That way, if they want to read the book, they can just skip that chapter. But not often people do that, but doesn't mean you can't. You could obviously say, like, chapter 25, this includes ideations of self-harm. For those who don't want to read this, skip this chapter. Here's a recap of kind of what happens in this chapter. So you can do that as well. It takes more work, obviously, but sometimes people really appreciate that even more, because then they doesn't mean I just don't read the book. It means, oh, I skipped that chapter. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts? Did your thought finally arrive, or did it never left? It never came to the station. Okay. I was like, maybe if we stall. The train derailed and it fell over. No survivors. I feel that. Yeah, it's hard. It's tough with tricky topics, but I think it's an important thing to address, because these are all things that you could include in your novel that would enhance your novel. Sexism is a very real thing that people struggle with. Racism is a very real thing that people struggle with. And even if it doesn't happen here as much as it could in other places, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I have been working as an editor as part of a teen magazine for a while, and I didn't realize how bad sexism still is in India until I started getting some short stories from young ladies who were in India, and they were like, yeah, this is pretty much an average day for me. I was like, holy crap, that's bad. That's so bad. And it made me sad, because I'm like, we have all these like realizations that women are just as powerful as men, and that they don't need to, just stay home and have kids, and yet a lot of women are still being told that's all they're good for. And that's sad. That makes me sad. And so it's important to address these kinds of things in literature. Address that racism is bad. Address that sexism is bad. Address that people have mental health issues and that it's a struggle for them. Address disability. Address things like that. But just make sure you're doing it you do your research, and that when you do it, you're doing it in a very polite, kind way. And if you're not doing it in a polite way, make sure you address that's not okay. Make sure you address that character is being a bad person. Don't just be like, they're my favorite character. Concern? Like, generally, you want to make sure you address that they're not, what they're doing is not okay. Sometimes people still like bad people. That's just a part of the world, unfortunately. But at least if you acknowledge that as a writer, you have done your duty to say this is not okay, regardless of whether or not other people are idiots. It's not your job to make sure other people aren't idiots. It's your job to tell people this is bad. If they decide not to believe you, that's on them after that. You did your job. Your job was to say this is not a good thing. Move on. You're not going to be able to change people's minds if they don't want to be changed, unfortunately. Unfortunate truth. Any questions specifically about going back to the politics topic, about writing dystopias and politics and things like that, or not so much? Okay.
I do have a quick question.
Yeah, shoot.
What would count as a dystopia?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, dystopia is the exact definition is basically a utopia gone wrong. The idea is they're trying to create the perfect society and in the process have done something wrong. So, for example, with dystopia, with Hunger Games, nothing wrong with having people split into districts. What is wrong is the forced mistreating of certain people in other districts purely because they were born there and then slaughtering their children. That's a problem. Now that's a problem. Or like with the book Divergent. There's nothing wrong with having people split into their best talents. I think that's a good thing. That's generally what we kind of do organically on our own, right? We say, I like gardening, I'm going to go do a gardening job. You know, we kind of organically do that. What becomes a problem is when you say there's only 4, and if you don't fit within those 4, screw you in particular, you're the worst. That's a problem. When you're like, I don't fit into a category, and they're like, well, you die now then. That's bad. So in general, dystopia is a good idea taken to the ultimate extreme that then becomes a bad idea. Oftentimes it involves someone in power being corrupt or several people in power being corrupt. You're welcome to do any number of things with that. But in general, it is simply a place, not necessarily a whole world, but often it is a whole world, a place in which there is injustice happening in the name of X thing, religion, government, etc. Someone thinks that X thing is a good idea and as a result does bad things to justify it, and creates a society that is built around those bad ideals. Does that make sense? Yeah. So you can have corrupt government and not have it be a dystopia. The difference is dystopia is pretty much universally accepted, whereas corrupt government is under the table, nobody knows about it, everyone thinks it's fine. To clarify as well. Any other questions? Cool. All right, then I'm going to turn off the video. Reminder, we have a fantasy spring contest coming up. It ends at the end of May, so you still have time. You still have 30 days to work on it, or less if you decide to procrastinate, your choice. You get to decide.
I've definitely never done that before.
And with that being said, I look forward to seeing your guys' entries for that. We haven't started it yet, but in the next 3 days, I'm going to see if I can get it figured out. We're going to also be, for this summer, doing a poetry contest. So if you're interested in poetry, or for example, song lyrics are very much considered a form of poetry. So you'd be welcome to do that. You're welcome to submit up to 2 poems, or song lyrics that read as poem. And with that, the prompt is going to be because it's with the summer reading theme, write a poem that is themed about either stories or themed about unearthing something. Can be, unearthing truth, unearthing a lie, something crazy, who knows? I tried to keep it very vague because poetry's hard. With that being said, those would be due by the end of June though, so you have a little bit more time. And then the top 5 people in the teen category and the adult category who win are going to be actually displayed out on that little mezzanine where we normally have art. So that's gonna be fun. I'm looking forward to it. When I heard that a lot of you guys were into poetry or poetic like things, I thought it would be a good idea. So, all right, I'm gonna turn off the video now. Let me know if you have any thoughts.
Right here. Right on the left.